We're standing at the gates of the underworld, but we don't really believe that's where we are. Maybe we even think it's paradise that's being imposed on us, so to speak. But the threats that have grown so dramatically over the past decades hardly play a role in our everyday awareness anymore, or they shape us less and less. Maybe enlightened societies are actually a bit further along than those in power think. At least I hope so. I hope that this time we might become wiser without another war, and that we'll have to return to a kind of reflection that defines us as human beings, because our very species is being called into question. And when someone says that wars can only be ended through reason, not through weapons, they're immediately labeled a Putin sympathizer. In other words, there are prohibitions everywhere.
Why is it that the most vicious politicians are often the most thin-skinned? Against the current, about the person. Hello and welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media prefer to keep quiet about. Hans-Eckardt Wenzel is one of the outstanding poets, musicians, yes, thinkers, whose roots are in the GDR, yet who continue their work in unified Germany without losing any of their depth or quality. He contributed to the book Abandon All Hope, Angry Looks. The authors include Alexander Rahr, Antje Vollmer, Daniela Dahn, Dieter Klein, Ingo Schulze, Marco Bülow, Mikkel Brie, Peter Brandt, Petra Erler, and Hans-Eckardt Wenzel. Hello. Hello, good day. The title Abandon All Hope goes back to a line from Dante's Divine Comedy. It says the main character reaches the gate to the forecourt of hell and is greeted by an inscription urging him to abandon all hope. Are we back there again? Are we once more standing at the gate to the forecourt of hell?
We're standing at the gate to the antechamber of hell, but we don't really believe that's what it is. Maybe we even think it's paradise that's been laid upon us, so to speak. But the threats that have grown dramatically over the past few decades hardly play a role in our everyday awareness anymore, or they shape us less and less. And Dante's line, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here," well, in a way, we've now been brought back to reality. The title actually comes from a small working group we're part of, one that continues the work started by Antje Vollmer. We meet once a month to talk and share what we've learned, about new developments, about the world's conflicts, and about what possibilities might still exist. And every year, we publish a short pamphlet which forces us, in a sense, to write a text that fits our theme. And last year, it goes back to a suggestion from Daniela Dahn. She said that hope, as Volker Braun once wrote, can also be a kind of trap. When we keep hoping, even though maybe we shouldn't have any hope left, we should really think about what that means. There's that great line from Heiner Müller, "Optimism is a lack of information." So how much are we ourselves caught in an ideological framework that still makes us believe in hope? And at the same time, how much do we actually need hope? Because without it, we couldn't act against the destructive forces that are dominating the world right now. That's basically the central idea of this book. And from different angles, with different perspectives, people have tried to circle around that question.
And yes, that's maybe just the short version. You said we're standing at the gates of the underworld, but that doesn't really register in people's everyday awareness. Where does this divide come from?
This division, I'm a cultural scholar, that's what I studied, goes back a long way. It started in the 19th century. Once machines began taking over so much of our world, our relationship with reality became more and more desperate. We've been drifting further away from what's real and living more and more in an artificial world. The philosopher Walter Benjamin described this in his Arcades project, where he says that humans suddenly create an enclosed interior space that pretends to be nature. In other words, we rebuild everything from scratch. And in that process, our relationship to facts has changed. On top of that, political ideologies have in a sense reproduced in our minds what the machinery had already done in the physical world. And the fact that we no longer really perceive the horrors has to do, I'd say quite simply, with the censorship that military censorship has imposed on wars. The images we still had during the Vietnam War, the ones that showed us what cruelty a war really means, how much misery and suffering it brings, those images are gone. There are no pictures of war anymore. Or if there are, people say they're fake news from the internet, at least not in the public media. And now suddenly, terms like military readiness are seen as something positive. All those expressions that were deeply questioned in Germany after the war. But now we're hearing again about the northern flank of NATO. That sounds very much like Barbarossa, like the war plans of the Nazis.
An die Kriegspläne der Nazis. Das heißt, wir haben sprachlich und auch kulturell eine Veränderung all dieser Dinge, dass wir die Schrecken, die mit dem Krieg zusammenhängen, nicht mehr visuell und auch nicht mehr intellektuell und auch nicht mehr emotional zur Verfügung haben. Ich meine, der Vorgang, dass jeden Tag an der ukrainisch-russischen Front paar tausend Söhne, Kinder, Frauen, Männer ums Leben kommen. Jeder einzelne Tod erschreckt uns, wenn er in der Familie ist. Aber in diesen Kriegen erstaunen wir, ach was, bloß 200 Tote diesen Tag oder so. Das ist ein eigenartiges.
One that has damaged us as a species and one we have to resist. That's why I believe this awareness, that we're standing at the gates of hell, never really takes hold.
In his Arcades project, Walter Benjamin notes, if I remember correctly, on page 562, that the catastrophe is that things just keep going on. The catastrophe isn't that the disaster happens, but that it continues. That we remain within the catastrophe and stay there without even noticing the slaughter anymore.
Exactly. It's a strange condition that calls our very species into question. We're questioning ourselves as a species in several ways right now. We're questioning ourselves ecologically, because we're in the process of destroying this planet. We're questioning ourselves philosophically, in how we reflect on the world we live in. And ultimately, we're questioning ourselves as a species because we no longer see other people as belonging to us. The moment we're able to portray another nation or another leader as a beast or a barbarian, they're no longer on our level. And that, in a way, gives us permission to kill them for the sake of the good. And that is the state of war.
Are the evil spirits of the past coming back to haunt us like the undead? I think that has a lot to do with it.
And the fear that today's political elites have of the story of the Second World War and its ending, that it was above all the Red Army, with all its sacrifices, and that the Russian people, the Ukrainian people, and all those united in the Soviet Union carried the main burden of that liberation. That fear is being managed bit by changing the narrative. In Dresden, out of revenge against Putin, the Dostoevsky monument was taken down. Just think about what kind of state of mind that shows. It means the ghosts of the past, the ones from before that liberation, are supposed to be set free again. It's always about the dead. When we think about the world we dream of and the world we want to shape, it's about how we deal with our dead. And that's a crucial point.
You also contributed a poem to this book. It's called In the Countries the War Sleeps. Yes.
In every country, war lies sleeping, a hidden monster. When it wakes, it wants music and a great fire. It wants to be received with pomp, with wise sayings, with applause, with voices calling out its arrival. It demands human sacrifice. Every war needs fresh blood, or nothing gets done, an enemy who does evil and the best weapons, and when the sky still smells of excrement, all hands go up in the parliaments. Every place becomes a front. You have to show the flag. Big words are spoken, and the stocks go up. All for democracy at home, so that we may succeed. Because war, as everyone knows, is the father of all things. And when it's finally lost, people start talking about suffering. And those who once swore loyalty to it stay silent for a few weeks.
Rosa Luxemburg once wrote, "Stock prices rise and the workers fall." Why doesn't that register in people's everyday awareness?
I think that after the collapse of the East and the socialist ideas that came with it, we've kind of developed a mental block against calling and analyzing the society we live in as capitalist. And that's a problem. We're basically stuck in two categories, democratic and despotic. But those, as you might say in mathematics, aren't sufficient terms to define a society because they assume some kind of absolute. Yet in reality, there's this kind of democracy, and that kind, and another one. And then there's this kind of despotism, or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, we're stuck in those two terms, and we've stopped analyzing the ownership structures that obviously go along with them. And even in our current crises, we no longer look at those connections. I mean, the analogies people are drawing now through big think tanks and policy institutes, this whole idea of a firewall, of trying to prevent another 1933, that's nonsense, pure ideological nonsense. If you actually look at the situation back then, the Nazi Party was on the decline. They only gained power after the big industrialists met with Hitler and came to an agreement. In other words, the moment it becomes effective or profitable for the industries, for the industrialists, for the people with capital who are driven by profit, they'll jump on board. For profit. A fascist version, or whatever you want to call it. We don't have that right now. And all those kinds of analyses just don't happen anymore. I mean, there's a wonderful analysis by a forgotten best-selling author, Karl Marx, about capital, about how money and commodities work. We're still living with those same conditions, but it's not considered outdated to talk about them at that level in society. That's why companies like Rheinmetall only show up here and there. And then you hear about their profit margins, 400% last year. But otherwise, it's not a topic. It's all about honor. In war, it's always about honor, never about money.
Can there even be democracy under capitalist conditions? After all, the means of production are privately owned, and that means they're not democratized.
That's definitely a question, and it's one that hasn't been resolved, because pure socialization, in that form, simply didn't work. The Chinese model might be one that shows us how, with more flexibility, meaning by responding to the needs of the middle class, it might actually be possible to prevent a large-scale capitalist industry from emerging. In other words, to prevent monopolies from forming in society. I think that was one of the mistakes, for example, in East Germany, that they didn't rely on the middle class. And that's also the mistake of today's Federal Republic. The middle class pays the taxes, does all the work, and now gets hit with high fuel prices on top of it, to the point where it's barely able to survive and doesn't know what to do with its anger. The democratic structure doesn't give it a way to deal with that anger.
They say we need to become capable of waging war.
That makes sense, yes. And that's why I do think it's a real issue, how far social control should reach into the economic sphere. We don't have that in our societies. We just don't. It doesn't matter which government is in power.
The society stays the same, so we also have a lack of democracy here.
Well, of course, it's not that kind of thing. If I take the idea of democracy and apply it to individual life, there was an interesting woman in critical psychology in West Germany back in the 1970s, Ute Holzkamp-Osterkamp. She basically said that as human beings, we have two levels of need, the sensual vital level and the level of reality control. The sensual vital level is about things like how many cars I can buy, how many rooms I have. But reality control, that's about how far I'm able to control and shape my world, my reality. And if we look at this from a democratic point of view, we're underdeveloped. The ways we can actually control our reality are shrinking more and more. The people we elect just do whatever they want. They don't even feel guilty about it anymore. I'd say, 20 years ago, a politician like the mayor of Berlin, who went off to play tennis while half the city was sitting in the dark, would have resigned afterward. Nobody even thinks of that anymore.
Are we in a situation where the elites are mentally falling apart?
Yes, I think that's how it is. We can see it with the railways, the National Railway, everywhere. It's always the less capable ones who end up taking over the positions of those before them. For me, that's becoming almost a definition of German history. The less capable take over. And when they're gone, we have to find someone even worse. It's a decline. It's a system driven by bureaucratic gravity. We've built a bureaucratic state. If you look at how many people ride their bikes to the German Bundestag every morning, or how many head into the European Parliament in Brussels every day, those are crowds, almost like a working-class army, but they're all civil servants, or something like that. What that means is, we've built this enormous apparatus, and you can't even accuse them of being lazy. They're hardworking, just incredibly pointless. That's the strange thing. In that sense, we've bred an elite that's simply unable to respond to these crises.
People whose main qualification is that they once carried someone else's briefcase are now imposing sanctions on people like Jacques Bode, who have actually proven themselves in war and crisis zones. And that really has to be said. What does that tell us about their grip on reality?
Das sagt aus, dass man sozusagen eigentlich das Volk nur noch als eine geführte Masse definieren will, die gehorcht. Ja? Und das ist natürlich die Dummheit von diesen Eliten. Die Staatswesen zerfallen deswegen. Und nicht anders ist das Römische Reich zerfallen. Wir haben mehrere große Verfallsgeschichten in der menschlichen Historie anzuschauen. Das ist genau dieser Punkt. Wenn man sozusagen das kritische Potenzial, das, was widerspricht.
And the best example of that, well, the most fitting one, is Pinocchio, our chancellor. That's Mr. Merz. In the past, factories were named after our statesmen. There was the Ulbricht Works, Mr. Herner, Mr. Gewalt. Now months are named after them. A whole month of March is named after him. But as long as people like that stop responding to real conditions, the gap just keeps growing. And the community, the state itself, becomes incapable of acting.
Politicians no longer respond to real conditions. Is this loss of reality the prerequisite for being ready for war?
I don't think it's a prerequisite, but being ready for war can create an illusion. It can make people overlook things. We shouldn't forget that the ones who pushed the hardest in the war in Ukraine, the ones who tried to keep it going, even when solutions were already within reach, are politicians without stable majorities. Macron, for example, hasn't really been a president for about 3 years now. He thinks he's Napoleon and refuses to step down. Starmer's the same. He doesn't have a majority in the country either. Merz has a cobbled-together majority, one he basically patched up for himself. That means the people who act the most aggressively are usually the ones who aren't really sure about their own power, and they need the war. That's a government-driven kind of politics. You need the war to distract from everything else. I don't see parties anymore. I only see Germans. You know those old sayings. It's an old German story. The idea is to try to unite a divided people through a catastrophe, one that should actually be prevented.
Is this about shifting aggression toward an external enemy because the domestic problems aren't being addressed or solved?
Yes, that's definitely a kind of impulse. Aggression gets redirected, and attention shifts as well. It's basically a way of managing attention. Suddenly, the focus changes, and certain things start to look different. For example, 3 years ago, I used to travel a lot by train. I hardly ever saw soldiers. That's changed now. It's as if they're heading to the front or something. Really strange scenes on the streets. So what we're picking up unconsciously is a sharpening of social perceptions. I think that's almost being steered, the way these terms are being used. We've become numb to it. We just accept it, and we don't question it anymore.
Can we say that political weaklings are the worst warmongers?
I think so, yes. Weakling is always a tricky word. How do we even define it? We had weaklings back in school too, on the parallel bars or in gymnastics, and some of them were actually very smart. But I know what you mean. Deep down, it's the insecurity inside a person that drives that kind of aggression. It always happens when someone no longer really knows who they are, or when they need to cover up a sense of inferiority, like much of our political elite, who often lack proper training. I don't even know if some of them finished high school or whatever it may be. One doctoral thesis after another gets declared invalid. There's a guilty conscience at work there, and that gets compensated for through excessive aggressiveness or machismo. And I wouldn't limit that machismo to men only. You can see it in women too, like with Miss Callas or others.
It's striking that someone like Hofreiter, who'd probably get his long hair caught in the barbed wire, is one of the worst warmongers.
Well, first of all, it's a matter of definition. And then I think with Hofreiter, it's like this. These are people who saw a different political path for themselves back when the Greens were in power. He didn't get the position he wanted, so you have to shout a lot to be heard, and he was invited to every talk show. Within just a few months, he suddenly knew every type of tank and every kind of shell. That's quite a learning curve for someone like him. I called him Adolf Hofreiter at several concerts, and then I got sued for it. I just said, I have a terrible memory for names, must have mixed something up. But it did start with an A, didn't it? They told me I'd said he was a neo-Nazi, which of course isn't true. But what's happening there is really absurd. It's almost like a puppet show, if it weren't so sad.
In your contribution to the book, Abandon All Hope, you basically describe a play. Why did you choose that form?
I think the theatrical nature of politics also has to do with the fact that these aren't really politicians anymore, but people pretending to be politicians. You can have whatever opinion you like about them. Let me take an extreme example. Say Helmut Kohl. He didn't share my political views, but I have deep respect for him because at his core, unattractive as he was, mocked as a pear or whatever, he stood by his convictions and endured all the insults. That was simply part of it for him. Today, that's no longer possible. Now, they're just vain actors. When someone calls you an idiot or a fool, it immediately turns into something like theater, full of intrigue. Then the board of directors, or in this case the court, gets involved. People start imitating certain gestures. There's a scholar named Greenblatt, an American expert in German or English literature, I'm not sure which, who wrote a very good book. He compared Trump's rise to the Shakespearean king tragedies. And really, even though Trump isn't exactly a great Shakespeare expert, certain attitudes and forms of intrigue are laid out in Shakespeare. That's the nature of politics. And they're also, in a certain sense, quite vain. I mean, take Ms. Baerbock. We all know how much she spent on her makeup artist and her outfits. These are people who are mostly being coached. by designers, by image consultants, by people telling them, this is how you'll come across better, this is how you'll look better. It's basically a psychological model. They behave like actors in a small-town theater. When you see how upset Mr. Merds sometimes gets, or when he suddenly starts tearing up with a cigarette in hand, that's pure theater. That's not politics. That's turning events into emotional performances that have nothing to do with real analysis anymore.
What's interesting is that one of the politicians playing along with this game, Dr. Ralph Stegner, actually wrote his doctoral thesis on theatrical politics. Okay, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. And it fits perfectly with this image of Ms. Baerbock, who always lifts her arm just a little whenever there's a camera in front of her, so it looks more dynamic.
Yes, they're advisors. I know that with Angela Merkel, for example, only certain photos were released. Ones where, so to speak, you didn't look bad. It's like when a director tells the press after a performance, that photo, that one, you can use those. What I'm saying is we've reached a point where the end of art begins when politics takes over art. They all want to be like that. They all write their books, their memoirs, and if they can, they even show up in some TV series. It's all one big production that's completely tied to politics.
And one person is showing how it's done. That's the ruler of Ukraine.
That's right. Well, he's from Ukraine. I mean, it's the only country in the world where a political party was named after a TV show and the lead actor became president. So just imagine if here in Germany, we started a party called In All Friendship and made the chief doctor the presidential candidate. You can see what kind of staging is going on there, driven by the oligarchs and by international forces. He's an actor playing the little Napoleon.
And it reaches people, and they don't even notice it.
I think in the media, yes. I believe the approval ratings aren't as high as the government thinks they are.
Why do the media go along with it, this whole staging by politicians?
Here's the thing. This society thrives on belonging, on being at the center, not on the margins. But you can only really define a society when you're standing at the edge. That's when you can actually look into it. I once wrote a song that said, "Stay away from the winners, hold your ground at the edge." That's the mindset you need if you want to be analytical. If you want power, you have to be in the middle. But the media could have the chance to stand outside of that. The problem is, it's a tight market, and the rent still has to be paid. It's a kind of charming blackmail. You know, when you're part of the circle, and suddenly you get invited to talk shows, or you can help launch something, or you're given a certain interview topic. That's a form of corruption at work. And on top of that, we obviously have a monopolization of the media, except for the public broadcasters. But even there, it's not really different. It's still a monopoly, just operating in another way. Most of the print media are in the hands of a few oligarchs. People in Germany don't usually use that word, but to me, that's exactly what it is. It's an oligarchy that controls our media.
A small handful of people have the capital and the influence, and they make the majority believe that we live in a democracy. Exactly.
And the bold journalists. Well, I mean, there are enough of them. You shouldn't condemn the whole profession, and many of them suffer under that as well. But most of them, as we used to say back in the GDR about people like that, were bootlickers.
I'd leave that to the grace of the Lord. After all, I was a journalist for 50 years, and I wouldn't draw the lines too tightly, as Adenauer once put it. Why is it that the most malicious politicians are often the most thin-skinned?
That's a very interesting question. I think it's like this. If you want to assert the no, the negation that's tied to malice or to a destructive nature, you need unquestioned power. Only then. The devil, or Satan, however you want to put it in our biblical story, was untouchable. Nothing stood above him. And that kind of untouchability is something one has to claim for oneself. And in people who rely heavily on destructive forces, there's something dormant inside them. But that's also what defines all of us as human beings, something we have to learn and recognize, our shared humanity. In the end, we still belong to the same species.
Wir gehören dennoch zur gleichen Gattung. Und vielleicht gibt es so ein kleines, sentimentales, schlechtes Gewissen.
And maybe there's this small, sentimental pang of guilt that flares up, something you have to push back against. I think that's my hope, that we as human beings, as different as we are and as divided as we've become into opposing camps, will soon have to learn again, painfully, that we all belong together on this planet, and not keep up this excessive political division that the 20th century demanded of us as a species, which brought us nothing but disasters and grand experiments, whatever they were. Maybe we need to bring things back a bit to what's human and to justice before we start thinking about new alternatives for how we live together as a society.
Unseres gesellschaftlichen Zusammenlebens nachdenken.
Who's supposed to bring back our sense of humanity when war seeps into every part of society and makes everyone ready for battle? You've described that process.
Yes, let's go back to Benjamin for a moment. The catastrophe. Right now, maybe it's the catastrophe that's the only thing pushing us toward action. Maybe. I mean, after the First World War, people created the League of Nations because they thought maybe it's better if a few diplomats knock each other's front teeth out instead of millions dying in the trenches. After the Second World War, for the same reason the United Nations was founded. And now, the process of disempowering that institution has begun. We're once again in a phase of stupidity, where the horrors of the past are being forgotten. And there are plenty of people who'd love to lead us into the next war, supposedly so we can become wiser. But maybe, just maybe, enlightened societies are a bit further along than those in power think. At least I hope so, that this time we might become wiser without another war, and return to a sense of reflection that defines us as human beings, because our very species is being called into question.
Death penalty. Can amnesia be cured by a catastrophe? Maybe sometimes it's the shock.
That's the idea Benjamin was talking about. Sometimes we need a catastrophe to really understand what's going on. Otherwise, we're so lulled by our own history and our own lives. Yes, even by what feels familiar. We all live in our own little worlds. And then there's this digital universalism that's opened up, where we can hardly find our way anymore. It's only going to get more complicated as artificial intelligence moves deeper into our daily lives. It's becoming harder and harder to find our bearings in this world. Right now, we still have a decent overview, but we're not prepared for these coming catastrophes.
Wir sind nicht vorbereitet auf diese Katastrophen.
Being lulled to sleep in an age of disasters, in an age of nuclear possibilities, means that as a society, we're blind to the apocalypse.
I'd say it's Western civilization. It's sinking. I think it's reached a kind of cultural endpoint. Western civilization began back in the Renaissance, with this feeling that it was superior to all other cultures, that it didn't need them, that you could shoot the shamans in Africa, that you could wipe out the Chinese with drugs, that you were the smartest in the world. It created great art that expressed humanity's biggest dreams. But I think that form is coming to an end, and the solution probably won't come from Western civilization, if our species survives at all. Probably more in Africa, in India, in China, in completely different regions. So what's coming together as the BRICS countries, for example, from an economic point of view? I think that might be, well, maybe a glimmer of hope. The West has lulled itself into arrogance and hubris. There's also a very good article by Alexander Rahr in this book that describes exactly that, this hubris of the West. The belief that it owns all the good values, that it's always right, and that it has the right to destroy anyone who doesn't obey. That's coming to an end. I really think that's over. Are we witnessing the decline of the West? We are. I'd even say I've personally experienced that decline. I spent about half my life in East Germany, up to the age of 35, and the other 35 years in a united Germany. For the anniversary, someone asked me which time was better. I mean, you can't really answer that. What kind of question is that? But there are similarities. The situations are complicated, but they're alike in a certain lethargy, and in the way art suddenly becomes necessary again. I play a lot of concerts, around 100 a year, in front of very large audiences. And I notice more and more how much people need that. They need those moments when they realize their neighbor is laughing or thinking at the same point, that they're not alone with their doubts. That there's a counter-public now. It's a bit like what happened at the end of East Germany, when the media, especially in those last years, just stopped responding to the really complicated situation in the country, and people stopped having real conversations. In other words, the dialogue disappeared. And in many ways, I experienced that almost like déjà vu. There's just one big difference. East Germany collapsed into a hard reality, the capitalist Federal Republic, and that caught it. But if this country goes under, there won't be anything to catch it. It'll fall into nothing.
Can you describe more precisely the point at which societies or political systems start to tip over?
My sense of reality comes, of course, from the stage, from concerts, but above all, from conversations with friends, from what I read. I think it usually starts with the fact that what you and I are doing here no longer really happens, a serious dialogue. As human beings, we depend on the principle of dialogue. It's the only way we can learn, and the only way we can rise above ourselves. That's what's possible. That's what sets us apart from animals, whose capacity for dialogue is much more limited. We live in a monologic culture, and war is the perfect monologue when you have absolutely no interest in hearing the other side's response. But there's this great idea from Hans-Georg Gadamer, who said that when you start a conversation, you have to assume the other person might be right. And once that dialogical principle disappears from society, as it did at the end of the GDR, that's when things start to erode. Society splits into different groups that only talk among themselves, what we now call echo chambers. For me, that's always the beginning of what I'd call ruinous phases in a society. The dialogue still exists, but only in form, not in substance. It's no longer taken seriously. I mean, just look at how we deal with a party like the AfD. A large part of the population votes for that party, and yet there's no real dialogue with it.
But rather firewalls.
And that's basically a kind of defense mechanism. Sometimes I even get pushed behind it. So if someone wants to get rid of me, they just say he belongs over there. Nonsense. What's the point of that? Is that supposed to block any real dialogue? On top of that, we've got economic crises we're not even talking about. This country is deeply in debt. And that last move by Merz, because he couldn't push his special fund through anymore, he called the rejected parliament back together just to get himself a majority. That's a coup. That's not a democratic process. And that, too, is part of the picture. People are basically trying not to take economic realities seriously anymore. They just don't take them seriously. Since the war in Iran, we've had this situation with fuel prices. Nobody seems to think about the fact that every loaf of bread in this country is delivered by a truck. Every tomato, too. That means at some point, the extra money we're paying for fuel shows up again in the price of our products, and we end up paying it again. But that connection is gone. There's no connection anymore. No. Well, you're not really supposed to use the term anymore, but I will because it's from Helgi. No totality. You mentioned a coup d'etat.
Sie haben von Staatsstreich gesprochen. Ist
Is the MERS government a permanent coup?
Staatsstreich in Permanenz?
Ich denke, hat sozusagen charmante Züge eines Staatsstreichs, ohne dass
I think it kind of has the charming features of a coup, just without anyone having to run around with a gun. But the way it was carried out, and how they made sure, for example, that the BSW recount didn't happen, that's already a form of a coup. It's version 2.0, so to speak. Let's say they're just doing it more cleverly now. It's not like in Spain after Franco's fall, when people tried to take over parliament with firearms, or like in parts of Africa, where state systems are bombed out of existence.
Staatssysteme umwandeln. Für mich ist das ein Staatsstreich.
For me, that was a coup.
Das gehört für mich ein
And it's, well, that's actually part of what defines a coup if we look at it on the EU level. What's being done through sanctions against people who hold a different opinion, where in effect the Constitution is being suspended. We have to challenge that. We have to take legal action. Freedom of opinion is guaranteed to us by law, and it's being undermined. What else would you call it? These are special decrees, similar to the ones that were already common in Germany back in the 1930s.
In Deutschland schon mal üblich waren.
Warum?
Why isn't there an outcry?
Aufschrei?
Ja, ich glaube, der Protest ist diskreditiert.
Yeah, I think the protest has been discredited several times, and it's become fragmented. This whole divide and rule approach has worked. It worked during the COVID policies. That's where they practiced it. There was this really strict separation between those who supported the government or vaccination and those who didn't. They pushed through something that was just absurd. I always told my friends, there was this dispute among theologians in the Middle Ages, the nominalist controversy, where people literally killed each other over it. When I look at that today, I have no idea what it was even about. And I think that's how people in the future will see it too, that families broke apart over their stance on COVID. And then as the next stage, where things got even more intense, we had the war in Ukraine.
Nächste Stufe, wo es verschärft wurde, der Ukraine-Krieg. Mit welcher Vehemenz wurde auf einmal
It was striking how suddenly all the pathos of anti-war politics was taken over and placed entirely on Ukraine's side, without any historical context being considered. History itself became almost dangerous the moment someone tried to analyze the conflict. And we all knew. This text, by the way, I wrote it before the war in Ukraine. We all knew that if back then Scholz and Macron hadn't just stood by, if they had used their power and gone there, that war wouldn't have happened. We have to think about how a war can actually be prevented, and it could have been stopped right away in February during the talks in Istanbul. All of that, I think, has to be part of our reflection when we realize how deeply we're caught up in this.
dass wir da verfangen sind. Ja.
Keine einzige
Not a single initiative from Germany or the European Union to end the war in Ukraine.
von Deutschland
And at the same time, no public outcry against the war.
öffentlicher
Does that have something to do with the mobilization of fear?
zu tun mit der Mobilisierung der Angst?
Das hängt zusammen. Und es werden
These things are connected, and it's like the ghosts of the past are being brought back. We can't forget that there's a massive war going on in the Gaza Strip, in the state of Israel, and that war isn't being reflected on at all. The moment you speak about it, you're immediately labeled an anti-Semite. That means we've built all kinds of thought taboos in our society. We're told we can't go in that direction. If we feel sorrow for the dead in Gaza, we're called anti-Semitic. I think that's a mockery of the millions of Jewish people murdered during fascism in Germany, an appallingly narrow-minded mockery. And if we believe that wars should be ended through reason instead of weapons, we're branded as Putin sympathizers.
mit Waffen verhängen kann, ist man ein Putin-Versteher. Das heißt, überall sind Verbote aufgestellt.
Everywhere you look, there are bans and restrictions. But we can only change things if we name them clearly first. When we lose our language, we lose ourselves. We can't reach the truth anymore. It's like the story of Rumpelstiltskin. Once the king's daughter knew the creature's name, it lost its power. In the same way, we have to name the things that hurt us or disturb us, and for that, we need complete freedom. As for gendered language, I think it's an even stronger distortion. It damages our syntax, our way of thinking. In other words, we're being stripped of our intellectual tools, and that's dangerous.
Ist
Mr. Wenzel, for politicians who seem to have remained at the level of a child learning to speak, is the ban on speaking a tool of control?
ein Herrschaftsinstrument.
A ban on speech is always a tool of power at the level of political expression. In the arts, not really, but it hardly happens anymore. I once read an interesting doctoral thesis about the influence of Metternich's censorship on the work of Nestroy, a great Austrian writer. The author showed that censorship actually played a major role, because when Nestroy wasn't allowed to say there were no potatoes, he had to rewrite it in a way that people still understood it was about potatoes. And at the same time, it had to be so poetic that it could apply to any kind of shortage. We could have that option, but what also happened, I'd say, is a destruction of realistic art since the reunification of East and West. It's like what all colonial powers did in Africa. They buried and killed the shamans and the singers first. In the same way, there was a campaign against Christa Wolf, against Heiner Müller, against Russian-influenced, truly critical intellectuals who had a certain independence. In other words, those areas were also eliminated. And what we have now is an art scene that mainly produces entertainment. It's become a kind of wellness industry, intellectual or psychological wellness. That's what has emerged. And the other side is having a harder and harder time. That means, when we talk about language, that was the question. These barriers, this destruction of language, are becoming harder and harder to overcome. In the kind of crisis we're in right now, no one who's really worried about their livelihood goes to the theater looking for answers. Instead, it's a certain elite crowd that enjoys it when someone throws a diaper full of crap across the room. That may all have its artistic purpose, but the role of art in a society that's in crisis just doesn't work anymore, except for a few rare cases. And those exceptions aren't being heard. I find that very, very complicated.
Why is it that in a time when people are being told what they can and can't say, the very ones who should be speaking up, the intellectuals, are the ones staying silent?
I don't know if they're all failing, but I'd say a large part of them stay silent. And that, too, is a kind of failure. Others are rarely heard. I wouldn't want to generalize here. I really do know my whole circle of friends are intellectuals, and also just regular people. And we do speak up, but sometimes we might lack the stamina to actually write it down because, well, you need someone who wants it, a publisher, a newspaper, whatever it may be. We need someone who demands it from us. And that person just isn't there. It's like in that beautiful poem by Bertolt Brecht, The Making of the Book of Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu on the Road to Exile. It's about someone who's about to leave the country, and then the customs officer asks, "Do you have anything to declare?" And he says, "Nothing, just thoughts." And then he says, "Well, write them down, you can have my cabin." And that's where the great book was written. And the ending of that poem goes, "So let the tax collector be thanked as well, for he demanded the truth from him." And of course, an intellectual is not a politician. He's not someone who stands on stage like a kind of tribune. But he does have to find his way into a context where his ideas can actually be used. That's when he can have an impact. And those contexts of use are difficult. We don't have intellectuals in government. We're anti-intellectual. Jens Spahn is not an intellectual. That would be a caricature of an intellectual.
Ein Anlass war für Sie die
One occasion for you was the presentation of Konrad Wolf's book, The Troika. You gave a speech, the opening address, and you referred to a quote from Brecht, "Great Carthage fought 3 wars." And in the end, of course, Carthage no longer exists in Brecht's poem. Were you using that to describe Germany's fate?
Beschreiben Sie damit das Schicksal Deutschlands.
Es ist bei Brecht eine Warnung. Es ist die Warnung.
In Brecht, it's a warning. It's the warning that we become, so to speak, untraceable if we don't wake up in times like these. What drives me is this thought from Brecht. What kind of times are these? When talking about trees almost feels like a crime, because it means staying silent about so many wrongs. That means we as intellectuals have to regain our ability to speak, or hold on to it, or assert it against all odds, so that we, as a community, as a country, can continue to exist.
Ein Wesen als Land weiter existieren können. Und es gibt wirklich, ich habe einfach
And honestly, I've had incredibly positive experiences with the people who come to my concerts. Very down-to-earth people. I live in Berlin and also in a small village, and I get along with folks there really well. I'm very happy to be able to talk with them. I'm very happy to live in that landscape, in that culture. I'm a deeply conservative admirer of Goethe, Hölderlin, and Schubert. That's the tradition I come from, and it's something I'd really hate to give up. My son is 14, and in his school there's no Goethe anymore, no Schiller either.
Goethe mehr und keinen Schiller mehr in der Schule.
They don't even teach that in school anymore.
No, now they're just reading, I think, Baldur von Schirach. Oh no, wait, that's his grandfather he's from.
Kann man es sagen?
Would you say that despite the positive environment you've created for yourself, the majority of Germans are dozing off into decline?
Stößt in den Untergang.
Ich weiß es nicht. Ich glaube, es ist eher.
I don't know. I think it's more like hopelessness is that feeling that you can't change anything. That's what we described as a kind of reality check.
Was soll ich denn machen?
What am I supposed to do? What can I actually change? My hope came when students started taking to the streets against the military service law. That's a non-ideological protest. And I think those kinds of protests will become important, ones that can't be absorbed by political parties, or where others say, you can't go there because that party's involved. That's basically how protest is usually handled. I think the drifting off, well, it would be arrogant for an intellectual to say that, even if I might believe it. But overall, I think the East is still wired a bit differently. There's a different kind of vitality there. The old Federal Republic still believes, by about 70%, that nothing has changed since 1978.
Zu 70% noch, dass sich nichts geändert hat seit 1978.
Kann man sagen, dass die Kritik fähig
Can we say that the ability to handle criticism increases from west to east, from academic urban circles to non-academic rural ones, and from younger to older generations?
von den Jungen hin zu den Alten zunimmt?
Von den Jungen zu den Alten glaube ich, das ist sowieso ein Problem.
From the young to the old.
gewesen. Das ist
I think
jetzt
that's
eher
always
so
been a
die-
problem of the human species. Right now, it's more about the arrogance of a younger generation toward experience. They grew up in an age where everything is information. They can look up anything. When I try to explain something to my son, he says, I know, I can just look it up. The information is there, but information isn't experience. And I grew up with teachers, many of whom had lived through the Spanish Civil War or had been in concentration camps.
Spanischen Bürgerkrieg, im Konzentrationslager. Ich habe sozusagen von ihren Erfahrungen eine
I'd say I learned an attitude, a way of thinking, from their experiences. They were great writers who shaped me, Stefan Hermlin, and many, many other important people. Even today, I still feel like a student compared to them.
kleiner Schüler gegen
When I do something, I sometimes think, what would my professor say about this sentence? That feeling, that sense of respect. This generation doesn't really have it anymore. In that sense, I'd agree there's been a shift, because that kind of experience just isn't there anymore. Among the urban elites, though, I think it's only partly true, because the big cities in the East have been taken over by the rich kids from the West.
genommen worden von den reichen Kindern des Westens. Also Leipzig ist für mich ein ganz typisches Beispiel für eine
So
Stadt, die
Leipzig to me is a
Wokeness
perfect
teilweise
example of a city that's partly drowning in wokeness.
Aber
Such a beautiful city. But that's where I first got banned from performing again. A club refused to let me appear because I hold a different opinion. I'm not allowed to perform there anymore. And then there were these 23-year-olds writing to me, saying my view of East Germany is wrong. What can you even say to that? They were so sure they knew better. So yeah, that's this kind of urban, or let's say pseudo-urban, elite that's formed there. It's a historical fart.
Historischer Furz, der wird verfliegen, bin ich mir sicher.
That'll fade away, I'm sure of it. It's something that won't last. It's so artificial. Abandon all hope, the book says. And yet, in some parts of that book, there is hope, you could say. Even the apocalypse carries a kind of hope.
Apokalypse ist ein Prinzip Hoffnung.
Selbstverständlich, solange ich noch weiß.
Of course. As long as I still know that it might be the apocalypse, or if I can recognize it when I see it, then I can still define it. It's like the story of Rumpelstiltskin. Once I name it as the apocalypse, that's the first step toward maybe avoiding it or doing something about it. But if I don't call it the apocalypse, and instead say, how can you say that? We're still in the antechamber of hell. We're the freest country that ever existed. We have the highest gross national product. All those success stories that are meant to lull us to sleep.
Dann definiere ich es nicht als Katastrophe. Und dann gibt es keinen Weg.
Then I wouldn't call it a catastrophe. And once you don't, there's no way out of it. Hopelessness is something you have to distinguish between depression and despair. In the story I'm quoting, by my friend Christoph Hein, he basically rewrites the Prometheus myth. Prometheus was punished by Zeus, not because he brought fire to humanity, but because Zeus had given people the ability to see into the future. They could know everything that was going to happen to them. That was their gift, and people couldn't bear it.
Das war ihre Fähigkeit. Und die Menschen haben es nicht ertragen. Sie sind daran verzweifelt, dass sie das gesehen haben, dass
They were in despair because they saw it coming, that their partner would soon die, or that war was on the way. And they couldn't live with that knowledge. To destroy this clear vision of the future, Prometheus gave humans hope. And ever since they've had hope, they no longer see the disasters ahead. That's a beautiful image, one I borrowed from Christoph Hein. And that's the danger we're in. As long as we stay aware of the risks and don't slip into lightheartedness, above all, into hubris and arrogance toward the world, I believe there's a very, very small chance we might escape this madness.
Es gibt eine kleine Chance.
There's a small chance to escape war and disaster, says Hans-Eckardt Wenzel, the poet whose feet are rooted in the soil of the former East Germany, yet who remains a sharp observer of the Federal Republic of Germany. Thank you for that. Here at Against the Current, we present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to hide.
Welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen.